Now pay attention, 007. Never let them see you bleed.
There is a perception in media and amongst general audiences that Daniel Craig's Casino Royale marks the first time since the early days of Sean Connery that James Bond felt like a human being again, with particular notice being given to his Bond's ability to, well, bleed. Casino Royale, more than any other Bond adventure, certainly lingers on Bond's wounds, and it features the famous torture sequence, of course, that is bound to make every man watching wince at least slightly. Yes, Daniel Craig's era has been somewhat personified by being more down-to-earth and gritty than his predecessors, with a large attributing factor to this reputation being both him getting visibly beaten up a lot, and the fact that we perceive the bonds between From Russia With Love and Casino Royale as being somewhat cartoonish supermen who breezed through life-defying situations with nary a scratch. That's not entirely true though, is it? Welcome to the Myths of James Bond, a series where we take a look at some of the larger public misconceptions surrounding the world of 007. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the general audience perception regarding Bond's ability to bleed, to take damage, to sustain injury, and how that image may not necessarily correlate with what we actually get in the film series. As I say, the early Connerys and Daniel Craig movies have the reputations of presenting Bond as a very much mortal man. He gets into fights and comes away bruised, battered, and bleeding, and this perception is very much correct. Even in the first fight of the series, 20 minutes into Dr. No, it's a relatively brief scuffle with a duplicitous driver, but while Bond doesn't receive any blows himself, he certainly dishes it out, and despite coming out on top in this fight, his knuckles are red raw from punching the guy so hard. Dr. No also features a sequence in which Bond is forced to crawl through some vents in the villain's lair, and he undergoes a great amount of physical hardship to escape. He's electrified, burnt, covered in radioactive water or something, and when he comes out the other end, he's bleeding and looking much worse for wear. This parallels, of course, with the Casino Royale torture sequence in showing Bond undergo a great deal of physical hardship, but through sheer grit and determination, he comes out the other end alive, even if somewhat bruised and beaten. Torture sequences are actually something of a staple of the Ian Fleming novels, with barely an adventure going by without Bond being subjected to some kind of horrific torture, but it's a staple of those stories that never really translated fully into the film series. Nevertheless, the next Connery adventure features the famous brutal train fight with Red Grant, a really visceral sequence in which Bond takes many a hit and comes out looking rather spent. The Craig films follow this format for a lot of their fight scenes too. Quantum of Solace takes the time to linger on Bond cleaning himself up after one particular fight sequence. Despite his reputation as the gritty, bloody, down-to-earth Bond, though, Craig's next two films, Skyfall and Spectre, don't show Bond undergoing much graphic injury. He gets into plenty of fights, and he is shot in the chest a couple of times in Skyfall and subjected to relatively bloodless torture in Spectre, but nothing to the extent that we see in his first two outings. And yet, his reputation persists, but what I'm more interested in talking about is the movies and actors that came in between those two, and why they carry the reputations that they do. Admittedly, you can certainly tell that the bloodletting eases up during the rest of the 60s Bond films. Connery gets a little bloodied after a visceral final fight in Thunderball, and there are certainly some very gritty fights in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but nothing that Bond comes away too shaken up by. I mean, the real pain Bond feels in that latter film obviously being more emotional in nature. However, then we come to the 1970s and Roger Moore, who is actually the Bond that I'm most interested in talking about in relation to the subject of violence. His Bond, more than any other, carries with him the reputation of being, just a jet-setting playboy, barely sustaining any injury, and just kind of meeting any dangerous situation with the raise of an eyebrow. And yet, when you actually look at his movies, that couldn't be further from the truth. Sure, there are examples where his Bond will get out of a hairy situation with the flick of a switch to activate some silly gadget, or a fight scene that he'll brush off with an adjustment of his tie, but this guy bleeds and goes through a lot more than I think general audiences give him credit for. There's a phrase you often hear when talking about Roger Moore's Bond films, and I've used it before myself, that's something along the lines of, in a rare moment of vulnerability, or in a rare moment of realism for Moore's Bond, or something like that. The gist being that Moore's Bond, suffering from some kind of pain, or being somewhat shaken up by a physical encounter, is a rare thing, and really when you look at his movies, it's not rare at all. Even in his first adventure, Live and Let Die, he sustains a real toe-curling injury when Dr. Kananga slowly slices his arm with a knife, and even in his second film, The Man with the Golden Gun, it shows him coming away from an early movie fist fight with a bloodied mouth. I mean, yes, he ends the scene adjusting his tie and giving a quip, but I don't think that should detract from the fact that he has sustained some real visual injury. Some people can still take pain and maintain a sense of humour, and I don't think that we need to necessarily follow every single Bond fight scene with a sequence of him, going to a bathroom to wash the blood off his face to understand that he has taken a real beating. Not to demean those sequences in Casino Royale or Quantum of Solace at all, but they are very much designed in a way to draw attention to the fact that Bond is bleeding and sustaining damage, and the series had never really before felt much of a need to get out the marker pen and underline those particular moments. The rest of the Moore era features its fair share of cuts and bruises, with two particular standout sequences I think that demonstrate Moore's Bond very much as a human character. The centrifuge scene in Moonraker and the safari scene in Octopussy, hardly two Bond films that leap to the top of anyone's most realistic Bond movies lists, but both these sequences play as torture sequences pretty much, with Bond escaping a few hellish minutes in the centrifuge, looking genuinely shaken up and quite out of it for a few moments, and in the jungle scene in Octopussy he runs into all kinds of dangerous creatures, and again, despite ending the sequence with a quip to some baffled tourists...
Are you with our group?
No, ma'am, I'm with the economy tour.
He takes a good deal of pain during that part of the film, and yet I think it's fair to say that audiences tend to remember, the silly Tarzan yell and the sitting tiger more than they do the blood-sucking leech or how exhausted he looks when he finally reaches safety. I guess my conclusion to these thoughts on Moore's Bond is that Bond has always sustained injuries and Bond has always bled, but the tone of the film surrounding those moments and the humour with which Bond may or may not brush off those moments is more of a lasting factor in the audience's minds than the specific moments of violence themselves. After Moore, we of course have Timothy Dalton's duology, and this era was somewhat characterised by a return to a more gritty Fleming style of story, and yet despite this, Dalton's Bond doesn't really get involved in that much physical action in The Living Daylights. He has a couple of fisticuffs, but neither of them leave him terribly bloodied or bruised. I mean, I think we see Roger Moore's Bond undergoing more physical hardship in most of his films than Dalton does in his debut entry, which is quite bizarre considering the reputations they both have. Things do change for Dalton quite rapidly though, with License to Kill. For my money, the better of his two films, and the one more in line with the public perception of him as a gritty portrayal of the character. In that film, he is beaten up, knocked out, and gets more bruised and bloodied than any Bond prior to him, and moving on from him, general perception would have you believe that Pierce Brosnan's tenure was more akin to Roger Moore, a bit lighter, campier, and yet his first two films feature some really gritty as hell fight scenes, and he ends both of those movies drenched in blood. His third features a full-on Fleming-esque torture sequence, and he spends much of the film dealing with a significant shoulder injury. Die Another Day continues the torture trend by having the entire credits sequence focus on Bond being held as a prisoner in North Korea, being subjected to horrific acts, and yet that film is often dismissed as being the most silly and fantastical of all the Bonds. Which it is, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have its own fair share of brutality. It is totally understandable that the overall tone of a movie can leave more of a lasting taste in the audience's mouths than individual scenes and moments, so it is fair that people come away from Moonraker remembering that Bond goes into outer space and that's all quite silly, and not necessarily the part where he's really realistically shaken up by a turn in a centrifuge, and yet the prevailing impression of James Bond in parodies and spoofs remains, this suave, pun-making, eyebrow-raising, tuxedo-wearing playboy who disarms goons without breaking a sweat. But why is that when we clearly see in pretty much every film in the series Bond is beaten, bruised, and bleeding at many, many points? I think answers can actually be found outside of the films themselves and more in their promotional materials, the likes of which you can see behind me here. Specifically, the posters. I mean, Bond posters have often depicted 007 in moments and situations that we do not see in the finished films. George Lazenby, for example, does not ski whilst wearing a tuxedo in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Roger Moore does not stand atop the Golden Gate Bridge wearing a tuxedo in A View to a Kill, and Sean Connery does not defy gravity wearing a tuxedo in You and with twice. In fact, he doesn't even wear a tux in that film at all, and yet these depictions of Bond, often, smartly dressed, with gun in hand, eyebrow raised, have been burned into the retinas of public perception and give lasting, indelible impressions of who James Bond is and how he's presented, whether that's indicative of what's in the films themselves or not. I suppose, in summary, I guess my point here is that each and every Bond film has its fair share of brutality that the hero must endure, and while the tones of each film may be wildly different, I think it's unfair to suggest that the likes of Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan played unflappable supermen, whereas, we see them bleed just as much as the perceived grittier Bonds like Connery and Craig. The tones of the films may be more conjunctive to perceptions of realism than individual moments. I admit that, and that's fine, and that is to be expected, but regardless of that, when looking at individual moments and scenes, every single Bond actor has conveyed a fair amount of grit and realistic violence, and Craig's Bond doesn't necessarily have a complete ownership of the concept of realistic violence in the 007 world. That is it for this edition of the Myths of James Bond. If you have enjoyed this video and want to check out other videos in this series, then please do head over to my channel, as well as hitting the subscribe button below to stay notified on future uploads, as well as all the other various James Bond related content I talk about on this channel. If there is a myth or general public misconception that you have in mind that you would like to see covered on this channel in future, then please do leave a suggestion in the comment box below. You may also below find links to my various social media pages, including my Facebook, my Twitter, and my Patreon page for those extra special 00 agents who want to go one extra step in supporting this channel. With all that being said, I think that's it. So long for now, Bond fans.